Nobody laughed at her. That was the unspoken rule that had governed every room Ursula von der Leyen had walked into across a decade at the summit of European power. You could oppose her, you could argue against her, you could vote against her proposals and challenge her decisions through the proper institutional channels, but you did not laugh at her, not openly, not on camera, not in the chamber of the European Parliament with every journalist on the continent watching and tens of millions of people following the feed live. That rule dissolved this morning, and the moment it dissolved, everything else dissolved with it, because the laughter was not the cruelty of political enemies who had always despised her. It came from people who had spent years defending her, people whose political careers had been built in part on their association with her leadership and her project. When they laughed, it was not mockery, it was something closer to relief. The relief of people who had been maintaining a performance for too long and had finally, in one unguarded public moment, allowed everyone to see what they actually thought. Outside in the streets of Brussels, 50,000 people had already gathered before she reached the microphone. The number was still rising, and inside that chamber, with her hands visibly unsteady and her voice carrying the particular quality of someone holding themselves together through pure trained discipline, the most powerful woman in Europe was about to discover that power assembled over years can dissolve in minutes when the room finally stops pretending. Powerful topic. The collapse of von der Leyen's authority in the European Parliament, the streets erupting, the moment of public reckoning. Building you a completely original script right now. Hook first, then section 1, then I wait for your order. Hook. Nobody laughed at her. That was the unspoken rule that had governed every room Ursula von der Leyen had walked into across a decade at the summit of European power. You could oppose her, you could argue against her, you could vote against her proposals and challenge her decisions through the proper institutional channels, but you did not laugh at her, not openly, not on camera, not in the chamber of the European Parliament with every journalist on the continent watching and tens of millions of people following the feed live. That rule dissolved this morning, and the moment it dissolved, everything else dissolved with it, because the laughter was not the cruelty of political enemies who had always despised her. It came from people who had spent years defending her, people whose political careers had been built in part on their association with her leadership and her project. When they laughed, it was not mockery. It was something closer to relief. The relief of people who had been maintaining a performance for too long and had finally, in one unguarded public moment, allowed everyone to see what they actually thought. Outside in the streets of Brussels, 50,000 people had already gathered before she reached the microphone. The number was still rising, and inside that chamber, with her hands visibly unsteady and her voice carrying the particular quality of someone holding themselves together through pure trained discipline, the most powerful woman in Europe was about to discover that power assembled over years can dissolve in minutes when the room finally stops pretending. Section 1. There are political moments that arrive with sufficient warning that the people involved can prepare for them, position themselves, manage the narrative, and ensure that whatever damage occurs is contained within boundaries that institutional machinery can eventually repair. And then there are moments that simply detonate. No warning, no preparation possible, no institutional machinery fast enough or sophisticated enough to contain what is released once the detonation begins. What happened in the European Parliament chamber in Strasbourg that morning was the second kind of moment entirely, the kind that veteran observers of European politics, people who had spent careers covering the institution and believed they had seen everything it was capable of producing, described afterward in language that kept returning to the same word: irreversible. Ursula von der Leyen arrived at the chamber at 15 minutes past 10 in the morning. Her security detail moved with the practiced efficiency of a team that had made this approach hundreds of times. Her senior advisors flanked her with the body language of people who had reviewed the morning's agenda and found nothing in it that deviated meaningfully from the kind of difficult but manageable session that the Commission President had navigated successfully on many previous occasions. She carried prepared remarks. She wore the expression she had spent decades perfecting, the particular combination of composure, authority, and calibrated confidence that had become her public face through budget crises and pandemic management failures and diplomatic controversies that had each in their moment seemed potentially fatal to her political standing and had each in their moment been survived. She had built a reputation on surviving, on absorbing pressure that would have broken other political figures and continuing to function, to lead, to project the unbroken forward momentum that institutions require from the people who represent them. That reputation was the invisible armor she carried into the chamber that morning. It did not survive the session. The atmosphere in that chamber was something that experienced journalists covering the European Parliament described afterward as qualitatively different from anything they had encountered in years of reporting from that building. Not the familiar tension of a contested vote or a difficult confirmation hearing, or even the sharpest moments of the budget battles that had periodically convulsed the institution across von der Leyen's tenure. Something older and more elemental than political tension. Something that felt less like a scheduled institutional proceeding and more like a verdict that had been reached through processes entirely outside the chamber's formal mechanisms and was now arriving to be delivered in the only setting that could give it the public weight it required. Every seat was occupied. The camera positions had been claimed early by crews that sensed something worth positioning for. Veterans who had covered the parliament for decades noted the specific quality of the silence in the minutes before the session opened. The silence of an audience that knows it is about to witness something and is holding itself very still in order not to miss it. The procedural formalities that opened the session proceeded normally on the surface. The agenda was read. The chamber president called the meeting to order. The ordinary administrative architecture of a parliamentary session was assembled around what was about to happen inside it, providing a frame of institutional normality that would make the contrast with what followed even more complete. The first voice that broke the frame did not belong to any of the political figures that observers would have predicted. It did not come from the populist opposition movements that had spent years defining themselves through their hostility to everything von der Leyen and the Commission represented. It did not come from the Eurosceptic right or the far-left critics who had consistently opposed the direction of her leadership on ideological grounds. It came from a German member of the European Parliament, a representative from within von der Leyen's own political family. Someone whose entire institutional positioning had been built around the same broad European project that she led and whose presence on her side of the chamber had always been assumed rather than earned anew each day. He rose from his seat, and the moment his voice entered the room, the nature of what was happening became unmistakable to everyone present. He spoke with the particular quality of fury that has been controlled for a long time, and is now being released with precision rather than abandoned to emotion. Every word had been selected. Every sentence had been constructed to land with maximum weight and minimum possibility of deflection. He described what he called the catastrophic erosion of European credibility on the world stage under the current Commission leadership. He catalogued the diplomatic failures with a specificity that made clear he was not speaking from political positioning, but from genuine accumulated despair at what he had watched unfold. He described the dismantling of alliance structures that previous generations of European leaders had constructed through decades of patient relationship building, sacrifice, and the kind of sustained institutional investment that cannot be replaced quickly once it has been destroyed. He talked about ordinary European citizens living with consequences that were real and measurable and devastating, while the leadership responsible for the decisions producing those consequences remained encased in a Brussels institutional culture so thoroughly insulated from the lived reality of the people it governed that the feedback mechanisms that should have corrected course years ago had simply stopped functioning. His voice never elevated to a shout. It remained level and precise throughout, and that precision made it more devastating than any raised voice could have been because it communicated something that anger alone cannot communicate. It communicated considered judgment. The judgment of someone who had examined the evidence carefully, reached a conclusion reluctantly, and was now stating that conclusion publicly because the private channels for expressing it had been exhausted without result. When he said that von der Leyen must resign immediately for the good of Europe, the chamber split along a line that nobody had quite predicted. Half the room produced applause of a volume and intensity that shook the physical space of the chamber in a way that several people present described afterward as visceral. The other half fell into a silence whose quality was not the silence of disagreement, but the silence of people confronting something they had not expected to feel, which was the recognition that what they were hearing articulated something they had been thinking privately for longer than they were comfortable admitting. Von der Leyen's face registered the impact before she had composed a response to it. The cameras were close enough and the feed was clear enough that the moment of visible shock, the involuntary physical response to hearing a member of her own political family demand her resignation in front of the world, was captured and transmitted to every screen carrying the session live before anyone in her communications team could begin formulating the message that would attempt to contextualize it. That image was already traveling before the applause had reached its peak, and the session had barely begun. The French representative was on her feet before the applause from the first strike had fully subsided. She did not wait for the energy in the room to settle. She did not allow the chamber a moment to recalibrate around what it had just witnessed and decide how to process it before the next wave arrived. She understood instinctively what everyone in that room was beginning to understand simultaneously: that momentum in a space like this is its own kind of force, that it builds on itself, that each voice that adds to it makes the next voice easier and the one after that easier still, and that the window in which the target of that momentum can mount a credible defense narrows with every passing second that the momentum continues to build unchallenged. She came with specifics. That was the detail that made her contribution different in character from the first strike, even as it reinforced and amplified everything the German representative had established. She did not speak in the language of general institutional failure or broad accusations about leadership quality that could be argued around through competing interpretations of the same events. She came with the particular kind of documented specificity that is impossible to deflect because it does not ask anyone to accept a characterization. It asks them to confront a sequence of facts and explain them. She talked about the diplomatic catastrophe with the United States in terms that laid out the sequence of events, the decisions made, the decisions not made, the moments when different choices were available and were not taken, and the consequences that had followed with the inexorable logic of effects produced by identifiable causes. She described the experience of watching the American administration decline to engage with European leadership at the levels of international negotiation where that engagement had previously been treated as foundational to the entire architecture of Western collective security. Not as an abstract diplomatic setback, but as a lived institutional humiliation whose full cost had not yet been calculated and would not be fully visible for years. She named the alliances. She named the specific relationships that had taken generations to build and that had been damaged in a period of months through what she characterized without hesitation as a combination of arrogance, strategic incompetence, and a fundamental failure to understand that the credibility of institutions is not a renewable resource that replenishes automatically after it has been spent. When she said that von der Leyen had single-handedly destroyed the transatlantic relationship that an entire generation of European leaders had dedicated their careers to constructing and protecting, the word single-handedly landed in the chamber with the weight of a verdict rather than an accusation, because the people in that room who had watched those